Gas prices are surging, headlines are flashing red, and the old school playbook says it's time to brace for a consumer spending freeze. But what if it's time to look at that playbook again? Here's the reality. Higher oil doesn't instantly kill consumer demand like it maybe used to. Today, gasoline takes up a smaller share of household budgets than it did a decade ago, at least in the US. And the top earning households that drive half of all US spending, they are even more insulated from that price shock. Consumers aren't necessarily closing their wallets. They are certainly opening them up online. We have e-commerce update numbers as well, continuing to defy the macro environment, recently capturing over 18% of all US retail sales and nearly 29% in the UK. Today on the podcast, we look at the oil shock myth, break down why energy is actually a macro stress multiplier rather than a spending killer, and explore why the digital checkout cart is still the strongest engine in global retail. I'm Kate Scott-Dawkins with Jeff Foster and Nidhi Shah from the WPP Media Business Intelligence team, and each week we unpack the biggest stories in media and marketing and why they matter for brands. Well, it's Friday again. Jeff and Nidhi, how is everyone doing? What's
Yeah, hanging in there. It has definitely been a trying week, I guess would be the best way to describe it, but it's definitely been an interesting week.
Yeah, same here. My week started off with the India winning the World Cup from the T20, so started on a
Congratulations.
high. So lots of celebrations there, and yeah, it's just been really busy this week. So yeah.
Well, lots of headlines about oil. I think we'll start there. Even for advertisers who may feel, quite, uh, removed from oil prices, whether that's due to shipping or, petroleum-based products, still very important just to the overall environment and, headlines and cost structures everywhere. So let's get into some of the larger markets, how exposed they are to some of these oil price risks. And just to set the stage, really what we're talking about here is the fact that due to the ongoing conflict in Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, which is where a large portion of oil gets shipped through, is deemed currently as less safe or not safe for those oil ships to be traveling through. And so that's really putting a bit of a shock on supply for now. So yeah, let's dig into it. Let's look at the US first.
Yeah, I mean, I think the U.S. is going to be an interesting case. Of course, the largest advertising market on a global basis, but U.S. is actually a net petroleum exporter. But of course, there's an important nuance. It's a net exporter of total petroleum liquids, but is still a net importer of crude oil. So there's that slight, that slight distinction. But the U.S. has been the world's largest oil crude producer since 2018. It was interesting, recent commentaries from the Feds that suggested a 20% increase in energy prices could raise U.S. CPI by approximately 1%. So, I guess that triggers a larger conversation of the anticipated rate cuts, how this could factor in if we're going to go from an environment where people are thinking about, multiple rate cuts this year to perhaps holding steady or maybe not even having any rate cuts or actually, increasing the interest rates. So I think that, opens up a larger question, and of course, and how that will have ripple effects through consumer demand and through advertising.
Yeah, it's those second order impacts. So certainly if we see inflation for US consumers ticking up to 1 percentage point would be significant, right? And that would we anticipate have multiple impacts. In some cases at a headline level, potentially positive for advertising growth because we measure that growth at a nominal rate. That is, we are not correcting for inflation. And so if prices were to rise across the board for items in, the US consumer basket, that could lead to revenues increasing for those companies. And to the extent that advertisers budget for media as a percent of revenue, when revenue goes up, often those advertising budgets do too. And that's something we saw throughout 2022 as we saw inflation increase and we saw, advertising revenue increase as well along those same lines. So could have a headline benefit in that sense, but the underlying truth would be, consumers that were even more stretched. But I think in the current environment, let's put what could happen to CPI aside, right? What we're seeing right now, I think one of the easiest assumptions to make is that higher oil means weaker advertising revenue. But I think that definitely is too simplistic of a read. So if we look at, and we'll get through a couple of other markets too, but if we look at gasoline in the US, it's currently a smaller share of household spending than it used to be. In the BLS consumer expenditure data, we can look at gas and other vehicle fuels. They were about 4.6% of average household spending in 2014. In 2024, that's down to 3.4%. And that decline shows up in every income decile. And, as mentioned sort of in the opening, when you look at that top decile, the top 10% of households, it's just 2.2% of its budget on gasoline and other fuels. So not to the extent that a big increase there is going to probably noticeably show up in their spending behavior right away, right? And that top 10% accounts for, now we know, nearly 50% of overall US consumer spending, according to Moody's. So in that sense, oil doesn't probably hit advertising through a direct gasoline squeeze as much as maybe some people think. It's really those second order effects, higher interest rates, if it leads to more overall inflation, more expensive travel. Certainly jet fuel is another cost that's going up, and potentially weaker housing and auto demand, partially off the back of those higher interest rates or continuing higher interest rates. So that's what we're looking for, right? When we're talking to advertisers and listening to commentary in the marketplace, it's about scenario planning, maybe more flexibility in media planning and budgeting, moving to platforms where you have the ability to move things around, and often also sort of a retrenchment to the bigger defendable bets, right? So we can often see in these periods of more macroeconomic uncertainty, sometimes we see ad budgets moving from second, third tier players into the bigger scaled players because those decisions feel more defensible. So yeah, not direct ad growth indicator, but sort of a macro stress multiplier, let's say. What about some of the other markets we looked at?
So just taking a look at Canada, which again is in our top 10 markets, meaning a sort of a similar thing. Canada, of course, is a net exporter. They don't import any oil or gas from the Gulf region, so they're maybe a little bit more insulated from that as far as that goes. Of course, rising prices will, affect everybody on a global scale. It's interesting to note that higher oil prices could benefit some of Canada's oil-producing regions like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador. But, again, you're going to see something similar in Canada, on a macro level. Canada's annual CPI was 2.3% in January 2026, which is near the Bank of Canada's 2% target. However, continuing increasing gas prices could affect that as well. So, maybe a somewhat similar story to the US, but they might be a little bit more, maybe have a little bit better protection against the overall prices, since they are not quite have quite as much exposure to some oil coming out of the Middle East.
How about in Europe, Nidhi? I know we often hear that there were stronger impacts on Europe, especially when it came to energy prices.
So Europe and the UK remain kind of net importers of energy, but especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that reliance on just general fossil fuels has come down, and the direct impacts to Middle East is definitely still small. If you're looking at some of the data that was released by the Eurostat for Q3 of last year, the EU imports 6% of its LNG gas from Qatar, and the UK only about 1% of its gas supply coming from places such as Qatar. There is a bit more oil exposure. About just under 12% comes from Saudi Arabia and Iraq for the EU. But I think, again, the direct impacts seem to be manageable where the EU has diversified partners. A lot of that energy being coming from the North Sea, for example, countries such as Norway, as well as other trading partners such as the US. But obviously there are indirect impacts where a lot of these commodities are being traded on the international market, and that any supply chain disruption in any part of the world, right, having an impact on those kind of crude oil prices, for example, and really filtering in into other markets, especially as competition also increases with existing kind of resources as well from other regions kind of who might be more heavily exposed to the Middle East situation, kind of looking at new partners within the space.
That's the thing about globalization, right? And we see it within our industry, but certainly across the macroeconomic environment too. There are real benefits to being able to focus on what you do well and purchase what others do well. It does make the world much more interconnected and interdependent when we have situations like this. And it doesn't matter, again, if it's, cocoa supply, like we saw with rising chocolate prices everywhere. I did see a headline. I haven't checked this up yet, but I thought I saw a headline about lab grown cocoa as a way of, helping prevent sort of this supply chain issue with bad crops. So I'm gonna I'm gonna look into that one. But there is this interconnectedness between all of these markets and regions, and when you introduce conflict or some kind of shock like this, certainly you feel reverberations around the world just in different ways maybe than you might as a direct partner.
I think the other part of this is also where that economic growth is some of Europe, especially in markets such as Germany, the UK, has slowing down, and any kind of, this kind of geopolitical tension having that single impact on inflation, for example, could have some sort of economic impacts in terms of growth for this year and inflation being higher. But again, as you mentioned, Kate, I think advertisers have seen a lot of instances in the recent years where they've been able to also plan for things and be a bit more flexible in that sense. So yeah, I think it's just that advertising growth probably not being so impacted that we're seeing the negative growth rates we've seen in COVID, for example, but more kind of focus on planning and going with those kind of top kind of partners and who they feel comfortable with.
Yeah. Let's touch quickly on APAC. I know this is a very economics and numbers heavy podcast so far, folks. It's good. It's good to understand the global oil market while it's being talked about in the headlines. I always used to love that item in, I think it was the Bloomberg emails, where it's like things to make you appear smart at dinner parties, basically. So now you can take this info on oil impacts on advertising to your next dinner party this weekend. What about Australia?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we were looking at Australia too. So Australia is a net oil importer, of course, and despite them being a significant exporter of coal and LNG, they're heavily dependent on imported oil and refined petroleum products. So they might have a bit more exposure than some of the other markets. It was interesting, according to government data, over 90% of Australia's fuel is sourced internationally and priced in U.S. dollars. So taking it one step further, pricing in U.S. dollars, the strength of the dollar, depending on the change in oil volatility, could have a little bit of a, more impact on Australia's economy than perhaps other markets. But, again, something to keep an eye on. And similar to what we're seeing in other mature markets, economists estimate that fuel prices surges could add approximately 1% to headline inflation, which would potentially push it above 5% by June 2026. If we keep these higher prices. Now, of course, there's a lot of ifs in that in that prediction from the economists,
Yeah.
but like you said, I think we've seen from the past how tying it back more into the advertising component, that as we discussed, that flexibility remains key, especially in these sort of big macroeconomic situations or macro type of events that are going on. I think people have sort of seen from the relatively recent years of COVID that it does make sense to maintain investment, and flexibility is key.
Yeah, we'll see how that impacts from our reforecasting in June. Australia had a couple of relatively slow years of growth, especially amongst the top 10 markets. And finally, we're expecting sort of above 6% this year, a little bit better in terms of growth. So we'll see whether that estimate remains. Part of that is going to depend, I think, on how long the conflict drags on. But yeah, they're just starting to sort of get back into a faster growth engine there. Let's stick with APAC. I spoke to Yolanda Ko, who leads our this year, next year China data. She said gas prices there are rising, though haven't yet hit the cap price where the government would step in with subsidies. So while consumers are feeling the pinch from things like factory automation and a shift to high-tech exports that are less labor intensive, as well as the ongoing property market slowdown, they aren't likely to find gas to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, I would think. There actually was some great reporting from the New York Times and Bloomberg this week on how China is seeming to manage this overall shift of their economy into a focus on AI, high-tech exports, what that means for the very large population of laborers, both those that are in maybe second, third tier cities or rural areas, as well as in heavy industrial districts like in the South, where, there may be less demand for some of those higher labor exports like clothing and toys, with more of those exports shifting into things like cell phones and solar panels. And those factories traditionally just have fewer workers, more automated or robot-based factories. And so that's going to be a shift that that market has to manage alongside, I think, trying to push more into a consumer demand heavy GDP. And those two things seem at odds to me right now. I don't know if you guys have seen any articles or done any reading on this, but that feels like a sort of difficult transition to make with such a large population as well.
Yeah, I've been reading some of the articles on there about it's a lot of a lot of interesting data points coming out about if it's deflation, inflationary type of trends. And like you said, it's trying to when you have such a large consumer population, making that transition is not something that happens quickly. So I think that does raise a lot of interesting questions as we're heading into this year.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that Yolanda mentioned, of course, is, and we've been talking about this, with the huge increase in EV sellers and EV purchases in that market, that helps in terms of, more people driving EV cars, and so fewer people at the gas pumps as well. And then, China, I think, has done very well in terms of renewable energy push for their own grid as well, which is something the US has not in recent years. Maybe some of this oil price will kickstart some renewable generation in the US. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Um,
we'll see on that
yeah.
one.
Let's dig into the next segment, really around e-commerce. We got some new numbers on fourth quarter e-commerce in the US. We've been updating our model for retail media sellers globally. A lot of these companies are pushing up into our top 50, and these might be names that not every marketer will know, especially if they're not sort of a CPG or typical retail media buyer. You have names like Rakuten and Coupang and Reliance Industries, Shopee, Mercado Libre. These are all now large ad sellers in their own rights internationally, who are really riding the wave of a move to e-commerce. Now, what we've pointed out in the past is that continues to be a slow build, right? There's in all the e-commerce penetration charts, we see the big jump during COVID and then sort of a return to a more normal uptick, because there's still a lot of commerce that happens physically in stores. And that's one of the other things you have to keep in mind as we push this conversation one level further to things like agentic commerce. The available market cap for that is still only at at its maximum right now, roughly the 20% of retail sales globally that are e-commerce. The rest of it is still in physical stores. So unless we're talking about embodied AI and agents that are robots walking down to the corner store, we're not going to get to a majority of consumer purchases, anytime within the next couple of years.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's interesting looking at the data, obviously the growth coming from e-commerce, but when you take a step back and you realize it's roughly, 18, 20-ish% on a global scale, there still is a lot of, shopping done in person. And, the people physically want to see the products and the goods and make their purchases that way. So you're right. I think we still have a ways to go, but Yeah, it's just, it's been really interesting to see some of the commentary coming in on the e-commerce spending, especially when looking at a global scale. Similar, I've had some very interesting conversations with some of our colleagues, more centered around the US and North America on e-commerce. And I think it's interesting. The bigger question is, when we've been talking about this a lot, is sort of like some of these niche or these smaller players and where they fit into the bigger ecosystem, with CPG driving a lot of the advertising volume. When you have like a more of a niche thing, not to pick on them, but like a Chewy, for example, that's very specialized in pets, or, like a platform like that, I guess, where do you find the continued growth? That's been an interesting question that's definitely been hearing that a lot lately from other colleagues.
I think that specialized players are actually almost more okay, right? They're more
Yeah,
insulated. If you are a beauty brand, even though Ulta Beauty is very small, it's probably big for you, right? I
right.
was looking at ELF Beauty the other day as a comparison, and Ulta Beauty is in their most recent 10K. I think Ulta Beauty was something like 15% of, I'm gonna have
Mm.
to go back and check that, 15%. Target was up there, Walmart was up there, double digit percentages of their purchases. And so, yeah, you're probably gonna buy retail media on Ulta Beauty, right? Even though it's relatively small as a global player, scaled player, even US player. And same thing for Chewy. If you selling pet food, that makes a lot of sense, right? What I think is trickier are those sort of mid-tier players who are more generalists. Now, we should tie in the other sort of news that's been going around this week, which is that OpenAI said they would step back from offering like full checkout within their app. So instead, in a retail situation, sending purchasers basically to a retailer to complete the purchase rather than managing that in house. So there's been a lot of speculation about what that means. I've no, insight into this in the company from an outsider, just thinking about what they're also trying to build in terms of advertising. That's a big ask already. So, I mean, when you think about, even if they are using AI to help them code internally, building all of these products from scratch is a big ask. And I personally have no doubt that they would eventually like to get to a place where they are seeing the full end-to-end transaction all the way down to SKU level, and that builds a, you know, tighter business case for them going forward in terms of brands working with them on an advertising and a commerce level. So I still would have to think that that's the end goal. Again, the outsider view, but the fact that they can take a baby step and maybe ruffle a few fewer feathers in continuing to send the actual transaction out to retailers makes a lot of sense. I don't see that as being a major change, just maybe a postponement in my view.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right. I think it's just more of a postponement than anything.
Well, yeah, we'll see. Those players I mentioned, Coupang, Shopee, Rakuten, all right around $1 billion plus or minus, right, in terms of advertising revenue. Right there's quite a bit on the line in terms of where that money is eventually housed. I'm also keeping an eye on Jumia. I think we mentioned this in a past podcast as well. They're large player in Africa, especially in Nigeria. But there was recent reporting from Business Insider around them stepping back from Algeria, partially, I think, as there was greater competition from some of the Asia-based players like Temu and Shein in that market. So really interesting to see how competition is moving to markets around the world, especially as the US has become a little bit less hospitable in terms of the de minimis change and some of those tariff costs. So yeah, lots to navigate, lots happening in the world of global economics and finance and consumer goods. Lots to keep us busy and watch as we go forward, and certainly keeping an eye on the retail media growth there too. Nidhi, anything else to add?
I think one of the fascinating things of commerce since I've joined the team as well and monitoring it over the 4 years is what kind of profit drivers are being generated as well. So when I joined and I was looking into the whole sector, more and more retail media players still building out their media networks, to now seeing not just US and China based players having that ad revenue, but that ad revenue expanding to other markets and other players who are also investing in their own media networks to kind of, and thinking of it as a revenue kind of generator within the business. So that's been an interesting journey to see.
Yeah, I mean, from our clients' perspective, though, as they get more mature, I guess, or as they look for additional sources of growth, one of the things I think I've been picking up on and reading in these financial documents is, take rate and monetization increases. And, there's going to be a level at which they have been the disruptors to a certain extent, and they are the point of sale. And so they've had, I think, a significant amount of power in some of those negotiations with advertisers in that sense. If we do get to a place where agentic commerce is more viable and you have folks like a Google, the OpenAI, whoever else coming in and saying, okay, well, we'll manage this for you. And at least to start, the take rate's going to be less than these, retail media players. That changes the calculus again, right? So there's sort of the position they find themselves in right now where they can maybe improve upon that ad mon. Lots of them are talking about it in terms of finding additional growth, maybe as the volume growth is less easy to come by, but you can see potential for future disruptions to put that under strain.
Even during the earnings season, right, there's been Walmart who's reported its Sparky Shopee AI assistant, for example, and we're seeing more users using it.
Mm.
Well, the company reports that. So, it's not to say that agentic commerce and that payment system is dead. It's just to say that, it's getting there.
Yeah. Well, and as
Yeah.
Amazon enters new markets with Rufus, they have their DSP now. They've been pricing that very attractively from reporting on it. So that, into new markets as well is gonna add pressure.
Yeah.
All fascinating.
It is, and just thinking of Amazon, which of course is, the market leader, then they're pushing to live sports and connecting more signals. It's gonna be very interesting to see how this space evolves, if there's gonna be more of a focus, for those who can afford it on the content side when you're looking at like a Google, YouTube, if you're gonna see that as as a way to try to solidify their marketplace.
I mean, it's a huge empire of content that I don't even think is as joined up as it could be or will be, right? When you think about all of those assets that Amazon does have, including Audible, including Amazon Music, including Twitch, Prime Video, which now folded in all the freebie stuff, plus the on-site inventory. It's, a lot to look at there for an advertiser in terms of being able to reach across multiple assets and contexts, including this is one of the things we talk about in the advertising intelligence framework. They have Fire TVs, right? So they can control the operating system level. They can surface brand messages across that as well as, on mobile or other environments. Lots to be looking at. There's a reason why they are, kind of right at the top of the mix there as an ecosystem builder. And it's because of that broad range of assets that they enjoy. All right. Well, let's leave it there with our thoughts on how the energy prices might reshape inflation around the world and how e-commerce has been rewriting the rules of retails. Definitely looking at additional news as we get it next week. Anything you're looking forward to watching?
We're really excited about finishing up Night Agent on Netflix. Just one more to go now. So hopefully I'll have that finished off by this weekend. Shouldn't be a problem there.
I've been watching The Apprentice on BBC, so I've yet to catch up on some episodes on that.
All right. Well, I've got the Pit, the episode I did not watch last night. And then I think, soon to be March Madness here. I've not thought about a bracket yet, but maybe we'll get there. In the meantime, thank you for listening to the WPP Media Intelligence Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you have any questions for the show, you can email us at business.intelligence@wppmedia.com. As a reminder, the Media Intelligence podcast from WPP Media is meant for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered financial advice.